It begins with silence, the kind that feels heavier than sound. A wooden porch in rural Ohio, paint peeling from the boards, a rocking chair swaying even though no one is in it. Inside, a single light burns over a kitchen table stacked with unopened envelopes. Credit card bills, overdue notices, final warnings. Each one printed in the same sterile black ink, but each one carrying a weight that feels unbearable. This is the story of the Miller family, though their name could be almost anyone's. Generations tied together by blood, love, and the constant negotiation with money. For them, survival has always had a price, sometimes measured in hours worked, sometimes in dreams abandoned, sometimes in dignity lost. But what happens when that price grows too heavy, when it presses down across decades, when it consumes not only a family's finances but their spirit? To understand that, we need to go back, through the history of America's financial system, through wars, recessions, the rise of credit culture, and the vanishing promise of security. What unfolds is not just their story, but the story of a nation built on borrowed time, where the currency is not only dollars, but sacrifice. And as we follow them across generations, we ask, what does survival really cost, and what happens when the bill finally comes due? Hey, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future videos. And drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. We'd love to see where our viewers are tuning in from. The Miller family story begins in the early 1930s, at the edge of the Great Depression. Henry Miller was a factory worker in Cleveland, Ohio. He woke before dawn each day, walking past shuttered storefronts and soup lines that stretched for blocks. His job, stamping steel parts in a plant that smelled of oil and smoke, was more than labor, it was a lifeline. One paycheck stood between his family and the breadline. At home, his wife Margaret rationed food carefully. Flour was stretched with water, sugar was hoarded, meat was rare. Their firstborn, Samuel, often went to bed hungry, though he never admitted it out loud. Children then learned early that hunger was not just about empty stomachs, but about the silence that settled when parents worried at the table. To understand Henry's world, you have to understand America in the Depression. Between 1929 and 1933, nearly 15 million people were unemployed. Banks collapsed, taking with them the savings of families who had trusted their money to vaults they believed unbreakable. In Ohio alone, more than half of banks failed. For working-class families like the Millers, there was no cushion, no safety net. Survival meant holding on by the fingertips. Henry's father had been a coal miner, his lungs scarred by years underground. Henry carried those memories as both warning and motivation: never stop working, never complain, never let your family see fear. And so, even as the factory announced pay cuts, 10% one month, 20% the next, he stayed. Because a job, however fragile, was better than none. The Depression also reshaped how Americans thought about money. Before, credit was a luxury, reserved for the wealthy. But as banks failed, small-town store owners began offering goods on trust: bread today, payment tomorrow. Margaret often walked home with groceries tucked under her arm, knowing that debt was quietly accumulating. She told herself it was temporary, that things would return to normal. Yet, in truth, normal had already shifted. For Samuel, childhood was defined by scarcity. He wore shoes until the soles split, then stuffed cardboard inside to keep water out. He learned to repair toys rather than ask for new ones, to stretch pennies into nickels in his imagination. More than anything, he absorbed the unspoken rule of the Depression generation: waste nothing, fear everything, save what you can. One evening in 1932, Henry sat at the kitchen table, his calloused hands trembling as he unfolded a letter. It was a notice from the bank, warning that their mortgage was 3 months overdue. The house, the small two-story they had poured every ounce of hope into, was at risk. Margaret's face went pale. For the first time, Samuel saw tears in his father's eyes. That night, Henry told his son a sentence that would echo through the family for decades: "We do whatever it takes to keep this roof above us. Always." Those words were not just a promise, but a burden passed down. Because in America, owning a home was more than shelter. It was proof of belonging, of making it through. For the Millers, survival meant clutching that dream, no matter the cost. As the Depression dragged on, families across the country shared the same struggle. By 1933, 1 in 5 homes faced foreclosure. Farmers lost land, workers lost dignity, children lost their childhoods. The Millers were just one family among millions caught in the tide. Yet, for them, each overdue notice, each thin meal, felt like a battle fought alone. And this is where their story begins, not with triumph, but with fear, scarcity, and the quiet determination to endure. Because survival, even then, came with a price. The Miller family carried the weight of the Depression into the 1940s, but the world was shifting. Factories that had once slowed to a crawl roared back to life with the march toward war. The Second World War became both catastrophe and opportunity, reshaping the nation and rewriting what survival looked like for millions of families, including the Millers. Samuel, no longer a hungry child but a lanky teenager with restless eyes, saw Cleveland transform before his very eyes. The same steel plants where his father had bent metal now pulsed day and night, forging weapons, ships, engines. Posters lined the streets: "We can do it." Loose lips sink ships. Buy war bonds. The Depression-era gloom gave way to a feverish sense of purpose. For Henry, it meant steady work again, though grueling and dangerous. He returned home covered in soot, his body aching, his hands cut from sharp steel. Yet there was relief in knowing the mortgage could be paid, the lights would stay on, the cupboards not entirely bare. Margaret volunteered with neighbors, sewing uniforms and packing rations. Patriotism mingled with necessity, survival was now tied to the nation's survival. But Samuel wanted more. He wanted out of the cycle of scarcity that had shaped his childhood. In 1943, at just 17, he lied about his age and enlisted. Like thousands of boys across America, he traded the kitchen table stacked with overdue bills for a military barracks. For him, war was not only duty, it was escape. War shaped an entire generation. Over 16 million Americans served in uniform. They returned not just with medals but with the promise of the GI Bill, a lifeline that would define post-war America. For the Millers, Samuel's service became both pride and fracture. Letters came home sporadically, filled with details he left unsaid. He described the camaraderie of soldiers, the cold nights in Europe, the endless marches. But between the lines was fear, the same fear Henry had tried to hide at his kitchen table. Margaret read each letter aloud, her voice trembling, while Henry sat in silence, jaw tight. The cost of survival had shifted, from financial debt to human risk. In 1945, the war ended, and Samuel returned. He was older than his years, his face leaner, his eyes carrying shadows he rarely spoke of. Like many veterans, he didn't share what he had seen: friends lost in battle, nights spent wondering if he would ever see home again. Instead, he looked forward. The GI Bill promised education, housing, opportunity. For the first time, the Millers glimpsed something like hope. Post-war America was a different country. Suburbs spread like wildfire, powered by low-interest loans and affordable mortgages. Factories churned out not weapons but refrigerators, cars, televisions. For a family that had lived through ration lines and foreclosure threats, this new abundance felt surreal. Samuel used his GI Bill benefits to enroll in college, studying accounting. He was the first in his family to set foot in a classroom beyond high school. Henry and Margaret beamed with pride, though they couldn't quite understand the textbooks he carried. For them, higher education was another world, one they had never imagined entering. But even in this era of prosperity, survival still had its price. America's boom was not evenly shared. Black veterans returning from the same battlefields were often denied the very benefits Samuel received. Redlining locked families of color out of suburban mortgages, ensuring generational divides. The Millers were fortunate, but their good fortune existed alongside the systemic denial of others. By 1950, Samuel had graduated and married a young schoolteacher named Ruth. They bought a modest home in a Cleveland suburb, complete with a tidy yard and a white picket fence, the kind of image sold in magazines as the new American dream. For the Millers, it felt like triumph. Yet beneath the glossy surface of 1950s prosperity, cracks began to show. The rise of consumer culture brought new temptations. Department stores offered installment plans. Credit cards, once unheard of in Henry's youth, began appearing in wallets. The message was simple: buy now, pay later. Samuel, eager to give his wife and soon-to-arrive children the life he never had, embraced it. A shiny car in the driveway, new appliances in the kitchen, a television glowing in the living room, all purchased on credit. For him, debt was no longer a shameful last resort, it was the engine of progress. Henry, now graying and worn, didn't understand. He sat in his son's living room one evening, staring at the gleaming television set. "In my day," he muttered, "you paid when you had the money." Samuel smiled, brushing it off. "Times are different now, Dad. This is how people live." But Margaret, who remembered carrying groceries home on borrowed promises, felt uneasy. She knew that every bill came due eventually. The Millers' story mirrored America's trajectory. The nation that had clawed through the Depression and marched through war was now intoxicated by prosperity. Malls rose from farmland, highways carved through cities, and families filled their homes with goods that promised happiness. Behind it all was a growing reliance on debt. For Samuel and Ruth, life seemed stable. He built a career as an accountant, Ruth taught school, their children grew up in safety and relative comfort. But every decision carried echoes of the past. Henry's vow, "We do whatever it takes to keep this roof above us," still lingered like a family motto, unspoken yet present. And Henry himself, he grew quieter in those years, his body breaking down from decades of factory labor. His lungs wheezed, his hands shook. When he died in 1957, the family gathered in the small church where he had once led Samuel by the hand. The Depression had defined him, and in many ways, it defined how his children and grandchildren would live, scarcity stitched into their DNA, even as prosperity seemed to shine all around. At the funeral, Samuel stood beside his mother, his own children clinging to his legs. He felt the weight of inheritance, not money, for there was little, but lessons. Work hard. Never show fear. Protect the roof over your family. Yet, he also carried a different inheritance, the rising belief that debt was manageable, even normal. That night, after the service, Margaret sat with her son at the kitchen table. She was older now, her hands frail, her voice thin. She looked at him with the same urgency Henry once had. "Sam," she whispered, "don't forget, the bills always come. They always come." Her warning cut through the hum of the post-war boom, like a faint echo of the Depression years. Samuel nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. For him, America felt invincible, its prosperity endless. But history has a way of circling back. Prosperity, like credit, always has a limit. And for the Millers, the next chapters of their story would test how much weight a family could bear when the price of survival grew heavier once again. The 1960s arrived with the gleam of progress, a decade painted in bright colors and bold promises. For the Miller family, life seemed steady. Samuel and Ruth raised 3 children, Michael, Anna, and little David, in their Cleveland suburb. Their home sat on a quiet street where lawns were trimmed with precision, and every driveway seemed to boast a car that shone under the sun. Yet beneath the surface of tidy streets and television jingles, America was changing. The Cold War loomed like a shadow, civil rights movements marched across the South, and the Vietnam conflict simmered, soon to pull in the nation's youth. And quietly, the economy that had surged after World War II began showing signs of strain. Samuel, now in his mid-30s, worked long hours at his accounting firm. Numbers were his language, and he tracked every paycheck, every deduction, every mortgage payment. But even with his training, he couldn't ignore what was happening to American families around him. Wages were rising, yes, but so were costs. Suburban life, once affordable on a single salary, now demanded more hours, more loans, more sacrifice. The Millers lived within the rhythm of the 1960s. Ruth packed lunches in paper bags, their children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, and the family gathered around the television to watch the moon landing in 1969. That night, as Neil Armstrong's voice crackled through the broadcast, Samuel felt a surge of pride, not just in the astronauts, but in the idea that his children were growing up in an age of possibility, not scarcity. But possibility came with pressure. Michael, the eldest, grew into a teenager restless with questions. He saw the civil rights protests on television, the images of marches and speeches. At school, he heard debates about the war in Vietnam. For him, money was not the measure of life, it was fairness, justice, freedom. Samuel worried. He had built his life around stability, but his son seemed to crave something more volatile. The economic winds shifted in the 1970s. Inflation began to rise, eating into paychecks with invisible teeth. Gasoline shortages led to lines at the pump stretching for blocks. Families accustomed to abundance suddenly found themselves waiting hours for fuel, rationing odd and even license plates. For Samuel, the déjà vu was unnerving. He had lived through scarcity before, and he recognized its scent. At the dinner table, tension grew. Michael, now a college student, protested the war and spoke of systemic inequality. Anna, quiet but observant, dreamed of becoming a nurse but worried about tuition. David, the youngest, still in grade school, absorbed it all without words. Ruth tried to keep the peace, passing dishes, urging conversation back to lighter topics. But survival had once again become a negotiation, not just of money but of values. The 1970s also marked a turning point for American households. For the first time, many families found that a single income was no longer enough. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers, not only for independence but out of necessity. Ruth, who had once dreamed of teaching full-time, took a job at the local library to help cover expenses. Her paycheck was modest, but it made the difference between comfort and anxiety. Yet even with two incomes, the Millers felt the squeeze. Samuel's once steady belief in credit began to falter. Interest rates climbed, mortgages ballooned, and the bills seemed endless. He remembered his mother's warning, "The bills always come," and felt the truth of it settle in his chest. One evening in 1974, after another long day, Samuel sat alone in his study. The desk was covered with papers, mortgage statements, tuition forms, credit card bills. His hands, once steady, trembled slightly as he held his pen. He thought of his father, Henry, sitting at a similar table decades earlier, staring at an overdue notice with tears in his eyes. The pattern felt inescapable, like a thread weaving through generations. Meanwhile, Michael's path diverged from his father's entirely. In 1971, facing the draft, he made a decision that fractured the family. Instead of waiting for his number to be called, he joined a group of students protesting in Washington, risking arrest. When Samuel learned of it, his anger boiled over. "You don't know what sacrifice is," he shouted. "This country gave us everything we have. Michael shot back, "This country takes everything from the poor to give to the rich." "Open your eyes, Dad." The argument left a scar. Samuel loved his son fiercely, but he couldn't reconcile his sense of duty with Michael's rebellion. The war had divided America, and it had divided the Millers. Anna, meanwhile, moved quietly toward her dream. She enrolled in nursing school, working nights at a diner to pay what scholarships didn't cover. She inherited her grandmother's resilience, stretching every dollar, patching every hole. She didn't complain, but she carried exhaustion like a cloak. When Samuel saw her asleep at the table, book still open, his heart ached. He wanted to give her more, but he felt trapped by his own obligations. By the late 1970s, America stood in a new kind of uncertainty. Inflation, unemployment, oil crises, political scandals, the optimism of the 1960s had given way to disillusionment. The Millers reflected that shift. Their once bright suburban life now felt strained, stretched thin by economic reality and generational conflict. In 1979, Samuel turned 53. He had worked his entire adult life, built a career, raised children, paid bills faithfully. Yet as he looked at his bank statements, he saw little security. Retirement seemed distant, maybe impossible. The promise of the American dream, work hard, save, and prosper, was slipping. That winter, a heavy snowstorm hit Cleveland. The family gathered in the living room, the house lit only by candles after the power failed. Ruth wrapped blankets around her grandchildren, who had come to stay for the weekend. In the flickering light, Samuel felt the weight of memory. The depression, the war, the boom years, the crises. He realized that survival had always come at a cost, and that cost had simply changed its disguise with each generation. As the storm raged outside, he whispered words his father had once spoken, "We do whatever it takes to keep this roof above us." His children looked at him, some nodding, some uncertain. The phrase had become less of a vow and more of a burden, passed from one generation to the next. And so, the Millers entered the 1980s, scarred by inflation, divided by ideology, yet still clinging to the belief that survival was possible. But the coming decades would test them in new ways. Credit culture would expand, debt would deepen, and the fragile balance of work and family would bend under pressures none of them could yet see. The price of survival was rising again, and the bill was far from paid. The dawn of the 1980s cast a strange glow over America. On the surface, it was a decade of confidence, booming stock markets, gleaming office towers, advertisements that promised wealth and glamour. Wall Street became a symbol of ambition, and names like junk bonds and hostile takeovers filtered into the public vocabulary. But beneath the glossy surface was something else, a growing reliance on credit, an economy increasingly built on borrowing instead of saving. For the Miller family, the 1980s were both opportunity and trap. Samuel, now in his mid-50s, watched the rise of Reaganomics with cautious hope. Tax cuts, deregulation, a culture of optimism, it sounded like relief for families like his. Inflation, which had gnawed at every paycheck in the 1970s, finally began to slow. Gas prices stabilized. For a brief moment, it felt like the storm clouds were parting. But even as the numbers looked better on paper, Samuel couldn't shake a sense of unease. He saw how credit cards had become common in wallets, how banks mailed offers promising easy lines of credit, how television commercials glamorized borrowing as a way of life. He remembered the shame his mother felt buying groceries on trust, the fear his father carried when the bank threatened foreclosure. Now, in the 1980s, debt wasn't whispered about, it was marketed as freedom. His children grew into adults in this world of contrasts. Michael, the eldest, had drifted further from his father's path. After the protests of the 1970s, he never returned to a conventional career. He joined a nonprofit focused on community organizing, scraping by on modest wages, moving from one small apartment to another. Samuel shook his head in frustration. "You're too smart to live like this," he told his son. Michael's answer was steady, "Money isn't the point, Dad. Dignity is." Their conversations often ended in silence, the generational divide too wide to bridge. Anna, by contrast, became the pillar Samuel had always dreamed one of his children would be. After years of sacrifice, she earned her nursing degree and took a job at a Cleveland hospital. Her paychecks weren't large, but they were steady, and she carried herself with quiet determination. Yet the hospital where she worked was understaffed, the hours grueling, and the emotional toll relentless. She often came home exhausted, her feet aching, her spirit drained. Still, she rarely complained. For her, work was survival, just as it had been for her grandparents. David, the youngest, embodied the spirit of the 1980s more than either of his siblings. Charismatic, ambitious, eager for more, he studied business in college and dreamed of making it big. Wall Street wasn't just a news story for him, it was a beacon. He idolized the men in sharp suits, carrying briefcases, speaking a language of deals and returns. For David, debt wasn't something to fear, it was leverage, a tool to climb higher. Samuel worried, but he also recognized something of himself in his son's drive. The decade pulled the family in three directions: Michael toward ideals, Anna toward sacrifice, David toward ambition. And Samuel, standing in the middle, wondered if his father had felt the same, a man torn between generations, carrying the burden of choices made long before. The 1980s also reshaped communities across America. Manufacturing towns like Cleveland, once strongholds of steel and labor, began to decline. Jobs moved overseas, factories closed, and the promise of lifelong employment evaporated. Samuel watched neighbors lose jobs, pensions vanish, homes foreclose. The stability he had clung to felt more fragile than ever. One evening in 1984, as Samuel walked through his old neighborhood, he passed the steel plant where his father had once worked. The windows were broken, the gates chained, the air silent. He stopped and stared for a long time, remembering the man who had taught him to fear nothing but losing the roof overhead. He realized then that survival wasn't just about holding on, it was about adapting, even when the ground shifted beneath you. The Millers adapted in their own ways. Ruth continued her work at the library, now a grandmother with silver hair. She helped Anna care for her young children, read books aloud at bedtime, and tried to soften the edges of Samuel's sternness. She believed in small joys, a garden in the backyard, Sunday dinners, photographs of birthdays taped to the refrigerator. She understood what Samuel sometimes forgot, that survival without love was just endurance. But financial strain never fully left the household. Michael needed help with rent when his nonprofit cut funding. Anna struggled with daycare costs and medical bills of her own. David, flush with optimism, borrowed heavily for graduate school and an apartment in New York City, convinced he would pay it off easily once he made it big. Samuel co-signed loans, offered what he could, and lay awake at night wondering if he had failed them. The 1987 stock market crash hit like a thunderclap. Across the nation, portfolios collapsed overnight, wiping out years of supposed gains. David called his parents in a panic. He had borrowed to invest, chasing the boom, and now faced debts he couldn't pay. Samuel felt the familiar weight pressing down, the echo of his father's trembling hands at the kitchen table. History, it seemed, was not a straight line but a circle. That winter, Samuel grew quieter. He spent more evenings sitting in his chair, staring at the glow of the television without really watching. Ruth noticed the heaviness in him. One night she touched his hand gently. "We've survived before," she said. "We'll survive again." But Samuel wasn't sure. For the first time in his life, he wondered if survival itself had become too heavy, if the cost was not just financial but emotional, generational. In 1989, Samuel turned 63. Retirement loomed, but there was little to retire on. His savings were thin, his pension uncertain, his children still in need. He thought of his father working until his lungs gave out, his mother whispering warnings about bills that always came due. He wondered if his children would inherit not security, but the same burden, survival as a price, passed like an heirloom. At Christmas that year, the family gathered in Anna's home. The table was crowded, laughter mixing with the clink of silverware. Children ran between rooms, the tree sparkled with lights, and for a few hours, the Millers felt whole. But even in the joy, Samuel's mind drifted. He looked around the table, at Michael's tired face, Anna's weary smile, David's restless eyes, and he knew that the story of debt, sacrifice, and survival was far from over. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, America stood at another turning point. Technology was rising, globalization was accelerating, and the financial system was weaving itself into something more complex, more fragile. For the Millers, the next decade would bring both opportunity and heartbreak. Because survival, as they had always known, never came free. The 1990s began with a strange mix of optimism and unease. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Cold War was ending, and America stood as the world's sole superpower. Politicians promised peace, dividends, prosperity, and an age of innovation. Personal computers crept into homes, the internet whispered of a limitless future, and Wall Street gleamed once again with the promise of wealth. For the Miller family, though, the new decade was less a triumph than a test. Samuel retired reluctantly in 1991. He hadn't saved enough, but his body had finally betrayed him. Decades of sitting hunched over ledgers had worn him down. His back ached, his hands cramped, his energy drained. He left his firm with a modest pension and social security, but the numbers never felt secure. He remembered his father working until he could no longer breathe, and part of him feared he was walking the same path. Ruth, still spry, tried to keep him buoyed with routines, coffee in the morning, reading in the garden, small trips to visit grandchildren. But Samuel's thoughts turned often to the past. He saw how each generation had carried the same burden, and he wondered whether the cycle would ever break. Their children were now fully grown, each carrying their own version of the struggle. Michael, still stubbornly devoted to causes over comfort, had aged into middle life with little to show in material terms. He worked at a community center, earning barely enough to cover rent and groceries. His clothes were threadbare, his car old, his apartment small. Yet he carried himself with quiet pride, convinced his life had meaning. At family gatherings, he endured Samuel's disapproving glances, though Ruth always slipped him leftovers wrapped in foil. Anna, in contrast, had become the backbone of the family. She worked 12-hour shifts as a nurse, juggling the demands of her job with raising her two children, Emily and Jacob. She carried exhaustion like armor. The hospital where she worked had downsized, pushing more patients onto fewer nurses. She often came home with aching feet, her scrub stained, her eyes red from fatigue. Yet she never complained, not to her children, not to her parents. She had inherited her grandmother's quiet strength. David, the youngest, had thrown himself into the booming world of finance. In the 1990s, Wall Street wasn't just a place, it was a dream. The economy surged, technology stocks soared, and young men in sharp suits spoke of fortunes made overnight. David thrived in that world, working long hours at an investment firm in New York. He earned bonuses that dwarfed his siblings' salaries, bought a sleek condo, drove a foreign car. He was the embodiment of the decade's ambition. But success came at a cost. His days stretched into nights, his health suffered, his relationships faltered. He told himself it was temporary, that wealth would buy him freedom later. Yet deep inside, He carried the same fear that haunted his father and grandfather, that survival required sacrifice, and the sacrifice was never enough. For the Millers, family gatherings in the 1990s revealed these contrasts starkly. Michael arrived in a faded jacket, speaking passionately about community gardens and tenant rights. Anna hurried in straight from a shift, smelling faintly of antiseptic, her children tugging at her hands. David arrived last, expensive gifts in tow, his cell phone buzzing constantly. Samuel watched them all with conflicted pride and worry. Ruth, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth the differences with warmth and food. The 1990s were also years of profound change in America's financial landscape. Credit card companies flooded households with offers. Student loan debt, once modest, began to balloon as college tuition outpaced inflation. The promise of upward mobility seemed tied more and more to borrowing. By the end of the decade, the average American carried multiple credit cards, and debt became not just common, but expected. Anna felt it directly. To pay for her children's education, she took out loans. She told herself it was worth it, that Emily and Jacob would have opportunities she never did. But each monthly statement brought a pang of anxiety. She knew what it meant to live under the shadow of bills, and she feared passing that weight to her children. Michael, with his modest salary, avoided debt as much as possible. He lived simply, almost ascetically, though it left him vulnerable. When his car broke down, he struggled to replace it. When medical bills appeared, they threatened to overwhelm him. His refusal to play by the financial system's rules left him exposed, yet he clung to his principles. David, meanwhile, embraced risk. He borrowed to invest, leveraged to grow, convinced that the market would always rise. The late 1990s tech boom seemed to confirm his belief. Stocks soared, fortunes multiplied, and David felt invincible. He called his parents once to boast that he had made in a week what his father once earned in a year. Samuel listened in silence, a mix of pride and unease twisting inside him. Then came the crash. In March 2000, the dot-com bubble burst. Companies once valued in billions collapsed overnight. Stock prices plummeted, investments evaporated, dreams shattered. David's portfolio, built on leverage and optimism, crumbled. He lost not just money but confidence. He hid the extent of his losses from his family, putting on a brave face at gatherings. Though his condo was suddenly up for sale, his car quietly returned. The Millers watched him with concern. Samuel recognized the look in his son's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in his own mirror decades earlier, the same look his father carried when the bank threatened foreclosure. History was circling again. The 1990s had promised abundance, but they ended with a reminder: survival was never secure, and prosperity could vanish overnight. In the spring of 2000, Samuel fell ill. His body, worn down by years of quiet stress, finally gave out. Hospital visits drained their modest savings. Ruth stayed by his side, holding his hand as machines hummed and monitors blinked. Anna took extra shifts to help cover expenses. Michael offered what little he could. David sent money despite his own struggles. One night, as Samuel lay weak in his hospital bed, he whispered to his children the same words his father had once spoken: "We do whatever it takes to keep this roof above us." His voice was faint, but the weight of his words lingered. He died a week later, leaving behind not wealth but a legacy of endurance. At his funeral, the family gathered in silence. Ruth, her eyes wet, held her grandchildren close. Michael stood quietly in the back. Anna wept openly. David looked down, ashamed of the secrets he carried about his own losses. The generational cycle had claimed another link, and the question remained: would it ever break? The 1990s had shown them promise and disappointment, ambition and collapse. As the new millennium began, the Millers carried their father's memory forward, each in their own way. Michael clung to principle, Anna to sacrifice, David to ambition. And Ruth, now alone, held the family together with the strength of love, even as the world grew more uncertain. The price of survival had not diminished. It had simply taken new forms, heavier and more complex than before. And for the Millers, the 21st century would bring challenges none of them could yet imagine. The new millennium began not with triumph but with unease. Y2K had passed with a sigh of relief, yet the optimism of endless growth had already cracked. The dot-com collapse lingered in the background, and David, once flush with confidence, was still quietly clawing his way out of the wreckage. Anna carried the family through steady labor, her days blurred into 12-hour hospital shifts, while Michael pressed on with his community work, earning respect from neighbors but little else. Ruth, now in her 70s, moved slower but remained the anchor. She insisted the family still gather every Sunday. Around her kitchen table, memories of Samuel hung in the air like incense. His absence left a quiet ache that no words could fill. Then came September 11, 2001. The morning began like any other. David, now back at work in Manhattan, left early, briefcase in hand. Anna was prepping for a long shift. Michael was meeting with tenants in a cramped office. Ruth was making tea. And then the world stopped. The images of planes colliding with steel towers, smoke rising into a clear blue sky, and people running through streets of dust seared themselves into memory. David survived. His office was blocks away, but he walked home covered in ash, his eyes burning, his chest tight. For weeks he woke in the night, hearing echoes of sirens. The city he loved had been violated, and he felt both small and exposed. The trauma wasn't his alone, it became the nation's. But for David, already fragile from financial losses, it was another weight he wasn't sure he could bear. The years that followed were shaped by fear and debt. Wars overseas drained resources, while at home, easy credit flooded the market. Banks loosened restrictions, offering mortgages to families who couldn't afford them. Subprime lending boomed, and the dream of homeownership spread like wildfire. Americans signed papers they barely understood, convinced that houses would only rise in value, that tomorrow would always be better. Anna watched it unfold in her patients' families. Young couples mortgaging futures for modest homes, older patients refinancing to cover medical bills, single mothers juggling multiple loans. The hospital itself relied on credit to expand, hiring fewer nurses while expecting more work from those who remained. She bore it without complaint, though the weight on her shoulders grew heavier with each passing year. Michael remained skeptical. He saw the desperation behind the glossy ads and handshakes. In his community center, he met families drowning in credit card bills, payday loans, and predatory mortgages. He tried to warn them, but few listened. In a culture where debt was normalized, his caution sounded like pessimism. David, desperate to prove himself after the dot-com crash, dove into the mortgage market. His firm packaged loans into complex securities, sold them as safe investments, and reaped massive profits. For a time, he felt redeemed. He bought a new apartment, upgraded his wardrobe, smiled more at family dinners. He believed he was finally winning. But beneath the surface, cracks widened. Adjustable-rate mortgages reset, monthly payments doubled, and defaults began to climb. David saw the warning signs, but he brushed them aside. Everyone's making money, he told himself. It can't collapse, not this time. Then came 2008. The housing bubble burst, and the collapse was swift. Banks teetered, markets froze, retirement accounts evaporated. Families across the country lost homes, jobs, and savings. The Millers were no exception. David's firm imploded. Years of work, gone in weeks. His bonuses vanished, his savings gutted. He sat alone in his apartment, the walls closing in, the silence deafening. Shame kept him from calling his mother, though Ruth sensed something was wrong. She always did. Anna's hospital overflowed with patients, some sick, others simply broken by stress. She worked until her body begged for rest, her hands trembling from exhaustion. Her mortgage payments edged upward, her children's college loans loomed, and the steady ground she had built her life on suddenly felt like sand. Michael saw families evicted from apartments, children carrying toys in plastic bags, parents begging landlords for more time. His warnings had come true, but there was no satisfaction in being right. He felt powerless, shouting into a storm that swallowed every voice. Ruth, now frail but unbowed, watched her children with sorrow. She had lived through the Great Depression as a child, through wars and recessions, through Samuel's quiet sacrifices. Yet the cycle seemed endless. She wondered whether survival in America always came at the cost of breaking something inside, a dream, a relationship, a spirit. In 2009, David finally confessed. He sat at Ruth's kitchen table, staring at his hands as he told her everything, the loans, the bonuses, the collapse, the fear. He admitted he was broke. Ruth didn't scold or sigh. She simply placed her hand over his and said, "You're still my son. Money doesn't change that." Her words cut through his shame, though they didn't erase it. For the first time, David saw that his father's legacy wasn't wealth, but endurance. The Millers had always survived, not because they were rich, but because they refused to let go of one another. The Great Recession reshaped the family. Anna's children, Emily and Jacob, entered adulthood under its shadow. Emily studied business, determined not to repeat the mistakes she saw around her. Jacob, quieter, leaned toward teaching, drawn to stability over wealth. Both carried the unspoken weight of expectation, to do better than those before them. Michael doubled down on his work, organizing food drives and housing aid, though funding was scarce. He grew older, his hair gray, his body slowing, but his conviction remained. He believed survival meant helping others endure too. Anna kept working, her health fraying. She developed high blood pressure, a nagging cough, back pain that never fully eased. But she pressed on, because she had no choice. Bills didn't stop. College tuition didn't wait. And her patients still needed her. David, humbled, scaled back. He took a smaller job, less glamorous, less demanding, but more stable. For the first time in decades, he began to question what survival truly meant. Was it chasing wealth until it consumed him? Or was it finding enough to breathe without fear? By 2010, the Millers had endured yet another storm. They weren't unscathed, far from it, but they were still standing. Ruth, sitting in her worn chair by the window, looked out at the world and whispered to herself, "The price of survival has never been small. But it's the only price we know how to pay." The echoes of Samuel's words lingered in every corner of their lives. And as the country staggered toward recovery, the Millers braced for what would come next. Because survival, they knew, was never permanent, it was always borrowed time, always one crisis away from collapse. The 2010s arrived with promises of recovery, yet the ground beneath America still trembled. Wall Street rebounded faster than Main Street. Corporate profits soared, while wages for ordinary workers remained stagnant. A new generation stepped into adulthood carrying debts their parents could scarcely imagine. For the Miller family, the decade unfolded like a slow tightening of a vice. Ruth, nearing 90, grew frilier with each passing year. Her hair, once thick and dark, was now thin, silver, and wispy. She shuffled carefully through the house, gripping furniture for balance. Yet her mind remained sharp, her memory vivid. She would sit in her worn armchair, telling stories of Samuel, of their courtship during the 1950s, of her parents' quiet endurance during the Depression. The younger Millers listened politely, but in their eyes Ruth often saw something else: worry about the future. Anna, the family's backbone, now carried not only her own burdens but those of her children. Emily had graduated into a world still scarred by recession. She found work at a small firm, but her starting salary barely covered rent, let alone the mountain of student loans that trailed her. Every month, she sent payments that felt like droplets against an ocean. She dreamed of owning a home, of stability, but the numbers on her statements mocked her. Jacob, finishing his teaching degree, felt the same weight. His calling wasn't lucrative, and he knew it. He remembered his mother's exhausted face after endless hospital shifts, his grandmother's warnings about sacrifice, his grandfather's haunted silences. He told himself teaching would give him meaning, if not wealth. Still, when he signed loan documents, his stomach tightened. Debt felt like an inheritance, passed down from one generation to the next. Anna herself was unraveling. Years of double shifts had taken their toll. Her blood pressure crept higher, her joints ached, her body begged for rest she could never find. Retirement seemed like a distant shore she might never reach. Each time she considered cutting back hours, another bill arrived: Jacob's tuition, Emily's car repairs, her own medical co-pays. She pressed forward, one weary step at a time. Michael, now in his late 50s, remained steadfast at his community center. His income had never risen above modest, but his reputation in the neighborhood was strong. Families trusted him, children respected him, and struggling tenants came to him for advice. Yet even his work grew harder. Funding was slashed, donations shrank, and the demand for help skyrocketed. He often wondered whether his life's work had changed anything at all. David, humbled by the crash, lived quieter now. He kept his job at a mid-tier firm, avoiding the reckless risks that once defined him. He rented a modest apartment, drove a practical car, and tried not to compare himself to younger colleagues who raced past him with ambition. At family dinners, he spoke less and listened more, though regret lingered in his eyes. The shadow of 2008 never truly left him. The larger world mirrored their private struggles. By 2015, the wealth gap in America had widened to levels unseen since the Gilded Age. The top 1% owned vast fortunes, while the middle class shrank, squeezed by rising costs and stagnant wages. Student loan debt surpassed $1 trillion, binding millions of young adults to decades of repayment. Housing prices climbed again, shutting out families who once dreamed of ownership. Emily lived this reality firsthand. She shared a small apartment with roommates, her walls thin, her privacy minimal. She often skipped dinners to save money, telling herself she wasn't hungry. When friends posted pictures of vacations or weddings, she smiled politely but felt a hollow ache inside. She had done everything right, studied hard, earned a degree, found a job, and yet she felt trapped, as though the future had been stolen before it even began. Jacob struggled too. His teaching job barely paid enough to cover essentials. He bought second-hand clothes, ate simple meals, and watched his peers pursue careers with higher salaries. Yet he loved his students, the way their eyes lit up when they understood something new, the way they confided in him about fears at home. He told himself meaning was worth more than money, though the weight of his loans told a harsher truth. In the background of their lives, technology transformed the country. Smartphones became extensions of the body, social media reshaped perception, and the illusion of connection masked growing loneliness. For the Millers, the digital world offered little solace. Emily scrolled through job listings at midnight, Jacob searched for side hustles, Anna read about rising healthcare costs. Michael shook his head at the disconnection he saw in the children at his center, who stared at screens instead of one another. Ruth, watching from her armchair, often whispered to herself, "This isn't the America Samuel believed in." In 2016, Ruth's health began to decline sharply. She suffered a small stroke, leaving her speech slightly slurred, her movements slower. Anna became her caretaker, balancing hospital work with tending to her mother. Emily and Jacob visited as often as they could, but the weight fell mostly on Anna's shoulders. At night, after Ruth was asleep, Anna sat in silence, her body aching, wondering how much longer she could endure. Ruth passed away in the spring of 2017. Her death was quiet, in her sleep, the way she had once wished. At her funeral, the family gathered again, united by grief and memory. Michael spoke of her generosity, David of her resilience, Anna of her unwavering love. Emily and Jacob listened, tears streaking their cheeks, realizing they were now the next link in the chain. Afterward, in the hushed moments of the reception, Anna looked at her children and said, "I don't want you to live the way I did, always tired, always behind. Find another way, if you can." Her words hung heavy, as though she knew the cycle might never break, yet she hoped it could. By the end of the decade, the Millers embodied the contradictions of America itself. They were resilient, yet weary. They had survived, but never without cost. Each generation had inherited both strength and struggle, sacrifice and debt. For Emily and Jacob, adulthood meant navigating a world more precarious than their parents had faced. Their grandmother's stories of the Great Depression, their grandfather's warnings about survival, their mother's weary sacrifices, all blended into a single truth: survival was no longer just about hard work. It was about enduring systems stacked against them, carrying debts they never chose, and fighting for a stability that always seemed out of reach. The 2010s closed with uncertainty. The wealth gap stretched wider, the middle class thinner, and whispers of another crisis floated in the air. The Millers, like millions of American families, stood at the edge of a new decade wondering, if survival had cost so much already, what would the future demand next? The decade of the 2020s began with a hush, and then, a storm. At first, it seemed ordinary enough, Emily working late nights at her firm, Jacob adjusting to his classroom of restless teenagers, Anna pushing through exhaustion one hospital shift at a time. Michael, older now and slower on his feet, still devoted himself to his community center. David kept to his modest office job, avoiding the reckless risks that had once consumed him. Life was hard, yes, but familiar. Then, in early 2020, whispers of a virus spread across the news. Few paid attention at first. It seemed distant, foreign, the kind of crisis that happened somewhere else. But by March, America was shutting down. Streets emptied, schools closed, offices shuttered. The hum of daily life fell silent. The pandemic arrived like an invisible thief, stealing certainty from every household. For the Millers, it hit with different weights. Anna, still a nurse, was thrust into chaos. Her hospital transformed overnight into a battlefield. Hallways filled with patients struggling to breathe, ventilators humming like mechanical prayers. Protective gear ran short, shifts stretched into nightmares, colleagues collapsed from exhaustion. She watched patients die alone, their families barred from rooms, and the images carved themselves into her memory. She returned home each night, peeling off her mask with trembling hands, afraid to hug her children for fear she carried death in her breath. Jacob, as a teacher, saw his world flip upside down. Classrooms dissolved into screens, children's faces framed by flickering webcams. Many disappeared entirely, lost to poor connections or chaotic homes. He tried to reach them, calling, emailing, urging them not to give up. But the distance was more than physical. He felt helpless, his purpose slipping through the cracks of technology. Emily, working in finance, shifted to remote work. At first, she relished the freedom, no commute, no office politics. But the pressure only grew. Layoffs loomed, deadlines tightened, her phone buzzed at all hours. She sat at her small desk, surrounded by silence, her eyes aching from screens. The boundaries between work and life dissolved, leaving only exhaustion. Michael's community center nearly collapsed. Funding vanished, doors closed, and the families he had supported for decades now faced eviction, hunger, despair. He tried to organize aid through phone calls and virtual meetings, but the need outstripped the resources. Alone in his small apartment, he felt the weight of failure pressing in. David, nearing retirement, faced uncertainty again. Markets plunged, then soared, then plunged again. He watched the volatility with a numb sense of déjà vu. He had lived through crashes before, but this felt different, chaotic, unpredictable, almost cruel. He clung to his job, grateful to keep it while millions lost theirs, but he knew the safety was fragile. The pandemic was not just a health crisis. It was a financial one, and its shadow stretched over every corner of the country. Unemployment skyrocketed as businesses closed. Lines at food banks stretched for blocks. Families fell behind on rent, mortgages, utilities. The federal government sent stimulus checks, but for many, it barely scratched the surface. And while ordinary Americans struggled, the stock market eventually surged back, enriching those who already had wealth. The divide widened, cruelly, unmistakably. For the Millers, survival once again meant sacrifice. Anna took on extra shifts despite her failing health. She developed a chronic cough, her chest tight, but she refused to quit. "If I stop, who will care for them?" she asked, meaning both her patients and her family. Emily sent money to cover groceries when Anna's hours were cut back. Jacob tutored students online for free, unwilling to watch them fall further behind. Michael organized virtual food drives, his voice hoarse from pleading with donors. David quietly dipped into what savings he had left, sending checks to his sister when he could. They weren't unique. Across America, families mirrored their struggle. Parents rationed meals so children could eat. Young adults moved back home, crushed by student loans and job losses. Grandparents died in isolation, their funerals streamed on shaky internet connections. The pandemic revealed truths long hidden, that the system was fragile, that survival was unequal, that one crisis could topple everything. By 2021, vaccines offered a fragile hope. Hospitals calmed, though scars remained. Anna's cough lingered, her strength diminished. She had seen too much death to ever feel the same. Jacob returned to classrooms, though many students had vanished, their futures derailed. Emily's company thrived on the rebound, though she felt guilty each time she looked at her bank account, knowing others had lost everything. Michael's community center reopened, but the needs had multiplied: mental health crises, homelessness, hunger. David, older now, began counting the years left before retirement, unsure if his savings would outlast him. The Millers gathered again, masked at first, then cautiously unmasked as months passed. Around Anna's table, they shared stories of survival, of patients who had lived, of students who had found their footing, of families who had been lifted by a little kindness. But the air was heavy with absence. Ruth was gone, Samuel long gone, and the chain of endurance now rested squarely on the younger shoulders. Emily, now in her 30s, felt it most keenly. She realized survival was no longer just her parents' struggle, it was hers. She carried debt, stress, and uncertainty, but also the weight of hope, that maybe her generation could find a way to break the cycle. Jacob, too, felt the burden. He told himself that teaching was more than a paycheck, that helping even a handful of students could ripple forward. But late at night, staring at his bills, he wondered whether meaning could fill an empty fridge. The pandemic had stripped away illusions. It showed the Millers, and millions like them, that survival was fragile, temporary, conditional. It could be undone by a virus, a job loss, a medical bill. And yet, even in the darkest days, they clung to one another. Anna, her voice raspy but firm, told her children one evening, "This family has always found a way. Through wars, through depressions, through crashes, we endure. Don't forget that." Her eyes, weary but fierce, shone with the same fire Ruth once carried. The 2020s had only just begun, but the Millers already knew, the price of survival was rising. And the question that haunted them, as it had haunted generations before, was whether the next crisis would demand more than they had left to give. By 2025, the weight of survival pressed on the Millers like a constant shadow. The world around them hummed with recovery, yet the hum felt hollow. Inflation crept into every corner of their lives: groceries, rent, utilities, and even the smallest purchases felt like heavy sacrifices. Anna, still navigating the hospital wards, carried exhaustion in her bones. Each morning, she rose before sunrise, her body already aching from yesterday's shifts. Hallways filled with patients who were sick, scared, or ignored by a system straining under demand. Protective equipment was scarce, calls from family back home went unanswered, and every decision she made carried the weight of life and death. She returned to her small apartment each night, coughing softly, her body begging for rest she could not afford. Emily, now in her mid-30s, faced her own daily battles. Her job in finance demanded constant attention, emails arriving late into the night, spreadsheets endless and unforgiving. Rent for her modest apartment consumed nearly half her paycheck. Student loan payments loomed like storm clouds. She often sat at her kitchen table, staring at bills stacked neatly like tiny tombstones, wondering how she had followed every rule, worked hard, studied diligently, built a career, yet still felt trapped. Jacob, steady in his teaching role, struggled with the invisible toll of 2025. Classrooms had reopened after the pandemic closures, but resources were scarce, students restless, and the emotional strain immense. He spent hours tutoring struggling students online, juggling grading, lesson plans, and household responsibilities. Each grocery trip, each bill paid, reminded him that stability was tenuous. He often whispered into the quiet apartment, "We survive, but at what cost?" Michael, older now, felt every year in his bones. His community center was alive with activity, but he moved slower, spoke less, and relied more heavily on younger volunteers. Families who once received his help with dignity now approached him with desperation, their eyes haunted by months of instability. He felt powerless as he watched their struggles, aware that no amount of effort could restore what society had taken. David, quieter than ever, observed the market's fluctuations with wary eyes. The stock market had recovered since the crash years ago, but every headline reminded him of past failures. He clung to his current job, thankful for stability yet haunted by the fragility of it all. He walked through the city streets, noticing the gap between the skyscrapers' gleaming wealth and the worn faces in subway cars below. It was a reminder that survival was rarely fair, and comfort even rarer. Inflation in 2025 wasn't just numbers in newspapers, it was felt in every tense conversation, in every rationed meal, in every skipped pleasure. Emily stopped buying coffee in the mornings, opting for water. Jacob traded fresh vegetables for cheaper canned options. Anna delayed personal medical checkups, putting her own health secondary to bills and responsibilities. Michael postponed maintenance at the center, stretching worn furniture and supplies further than was safe. Every decision felt like a compromise, each one another stitch in a fabric fraying at the edges. Family dinners, once a refuge, now carried a quiet heaviness. Conversations shifted from laughter to calculation: who could help whom this month, which bills needed attention first, who had time for groceries, who would cover a child's school expense. The Millers had always endured, but the endurance now was quiet, almost invisible. Exhaustion wasn't dramatic, it was slow, creeping, unrelenting. Emily, sitting late at night over spreadsheets, finally closed her laptop, rubbing her temples. She whispered to herself, "Is this what survival always looks like?" Endless work, endless worry, endless sacrifice. The silence of her apartment answered with nothing but the ticking of a clock, marking hours spent in struggle. Jacob, grading papers by dim light, paused to stare out his window. Children walked past, backpacks slung over tired shoulders, the streets quieter than they should be. He remembered Ruth's stories of endurance, Samuel's warnings about sacrifice. And he wondered if his generation would ever escape the same cycles that had haunted their parents and grandparents. Anna, returning from a long shift, sank into her chair. She lit a single lamp, the glow illuminating her tired face and stiff hands. Her thoughts drifted to the Millers who had come before her, each generation carrying the same invisible burden. She touched the wedding band on her finger, worn and smooth, a reminder that love endured even when resources didn't. And yet, she knew love could not pay bills, heal stress, or replace rest. The city itself seemed complicit in the weight pressing down on the Millers. Streets buzzed with signs of prosperity, construction cranes, luxury cars, billboards boasting wealth, but the reality for most was starkly different. Workers lined up for low-wage jobs, parents debated which bills to pay, students debated which necessities to skip. Every flash of abundance reminded those struggling of what they did not have, intensifying the quiet despair. Despite the strain, small moments offered reprieve. Emily found brief joy in calls with her niece, whose laughter reminded her that life still held color beyond numbers. Jacob noticed a student finally grasp a lesson after months of struggle, a spark of achievement against a backdrop of systemic neglect. Anna shared a fleeting smile with a colleague who survived another grueling day. Michael watched as a family he had supported for years managed to stay housed through the month, a fragile victory that reminded him why he endured. Even David, often withdrawn, found himself pausing to notice small kindnesses, a neighbor helping with groceries, a stranger holding a door open, the sunlight reflecting off the city buildings in the early morning. These moments did not erase struggle, but they gave the Millers fragments of hope, threads to hold onto as the world tested them again and again. By the end of 2025, the Millers carried the familiar weight of survival, not dramatic, not heroic, but persistent. Inflation, debt, exhaustion, they had become constants in life, shaping decisions and shading emotions. They had survived decades of economic turmoil, crises, and personal sacrifice, yet each year proved that endurance alone did not guarantee relief. The question that lingered, unspoken but ever present, was this: how long could they continue paying this price? The final months of 2025 pressed on the Millers with relentless weight. The air in the city carried a heavy stillness, a mixture of heat, dust, and the invisible pressure of unending struggle. Streets were busier, yet every step felt burdened with cost. Survival had become routine, almost mechanical: wake, work, pay, repeat, but the mental toll grew with each passing day. Anna's hospital shifted into overdrive. Seasonal illnesses, lingering post-pandemic complications, and staff shortages turned every ward into a tense arena. She moved from patient to patient, the rhythm of her work as predictable as it was exhausting. Yet predictability offered no relief, the constant vigilance, the decisions between life and stability, left her drained. Back at her apartment, she sat quietly in a dimly lit kitchen, peeling a single apple, savoring it slowly as if it were a rare luxury. Each bite reminded her of how little time there was for herself, how much she had sacrificed to keep the family afloat. Emily, navigating the harsh landscape of 2025's finances, spent hours each evening reviewing budgets and bills. She tracked inflation on spreadsheets, compared rental prices, and calculated groceries to the exact penny. Each number was a reminder: money never stretched far enough. Her bedroom, shared with the hum of her laptop and stacks of documents, felt smaller every day, claustrophobic with responsibility. Yet she refused to surrender. She reminded herself that she was surviving, that each day she made it through was an achievement in itself. Jacob, already exhausted from teaching, found himself pulled in countless directions. Students needed extra help, parents sought guidance, and the bills for his small apartment crept higher with every utility notice. Nights were the hardest. He would sit on his couch, grading papers by the glow of a single lamp, thinking of the students whose lives seemed tethered to their hardships. Each story mirrored a little of his own struggle, debt, exhaustion, fear of instability. And in that quiet, he questioned whether endurance alone was enough to protect the next generation. Michael, the family's quiet pillar, noticed the toll more in the subtle signs than in words. Families arriving at the community center moved slower, eyes hollow with worry. Donations had stabilized but were still insufficient to meet demand. Volunteers who had once worked with enthusiasm now arrived fatigued, stretched thin by their own struggles. Michael, still resilient but visibly aging, found himself counting days differently, weighing the energy he had against the needs he could meet. Survival demanded more than willpower, it demanded resources that were never enough. David watched silently, feeling the familiar anxiety of decades past. Stock markets fluctuated, inflation bit into his savings, and his modest salary, though reliable, did little to cushion the pressures around him. Each evening, he walked through the city streets, noticing the contrast between glass towers reflecting wealth and the worn faces in subway stations. The disparity was stark, and he could not ignore it. Survival, he realized, was often not just a matter of effort, but of circumstances beyond control. The family's small rituals, shared meals, evening phone calls, brief walks, became precious anchors in 2025. Yet even these were tinged with quiet tension. At dinner, conversations danced between work, bills, and fleeting news, rarely straying into moments of pure joy. Emily often suggested they spend time together, perhaps a short outing or a shared dessert. Jacob tried to laugh when he could, but the laughter felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with the next stressor. Anna, exhausted beyond words, often nodded politely, too drained to participate fully. Inflation continued to erode what little comfort remained. Groceries required careful planning, often replacing fresh items with cheaper alternatives. Utilities rose steadily, forcing careful rationing of water and electricity. Even minor repairs, an air conditioner on the blink, a leaky faucet, became sources of tension. Every decision carried the weight of consequence, every dollar spent was a dollar that could not be allocated elsewhere. Emily and Jacob began to notice the subtle cracks forming in one another. She, constantly focused on numbers, sometimes snapped at him for leaving bills unattended. He, worn from work and tutoring, sometimes reacted with irritation when she questioned his choices. Their love for each other remained, yet the relentless pressure blurred patience and compassion. They realized survival was not just an external struggle, it eroded relationships from within, testing endurance in ways no financial statement could measure. Anna, observing them, felt the echoes of her own past. She had carried her own weight silently, often prioritizing family over health, work over comfort. She recognized the same patterns forming in Emily and Jacob, the unspoken sacrifices, the silent exhaustion. She wished she could shield them, but knew she could only guide them, even as the world outside their walls continued to demand more than seemed humanly possible. One evening, as winter edged the city with chill, the family gathered in the apartment's living room. Emily had cooked a simple meal, bread, soup, and fruit. The air was quiet, punctuated by the clink of utensils and the hum of a heater struggling against cold. For a moment, the weight of 2025 seemed suspended. They spoke of lighter things, an old family memory, a shared joke from childhood, the memory of Ruth that still lingered. These moments, though brief, reminded them that survival also meant holding on to humanity, to connection, to the small threads that kept despair at bay. Yet as the night deepened, reality returned. Bills remained unpaid, inflation gnawed at accounts, and the world outside continued its relentless pace. Anna, eyes tired, looked at her children and said softly, "We've always found a way. But we must be careful. Each choice matters now more than ever." Her voice carried the weight of decades of endurance, yet also a quiet warning: survival had limits, and they were approaching them. Emily, staring at her hands, realized that financial stability, no matter how hard she worked, was a fragile illusion. She had inherited more than money, she had inherited responsibility, burden, and the unspoken expectation to endure as her parents had. Jacob, sitting beside her, felt the same pressure, understanding that love and resilience alone could not solve the structural challenges of their world. For the Millers, 2025 closed not with dramatic upheaval, but with quiet persistence. Every day was a negotiation with scarcity, with exhaustion, with the unyielding demands of survival. They endured, as they always had, yet the cost was clear: the slow erosion of energy, patience, and sometimes hope. Each family member carried the weight differently, but collectively, it bound them together, a shared struggle against a world that offered little respite. And as the city settled into the early winter nights, Emily, Jacob, Anna, Michael, and David sat quietly in their respective spaces, each lost in thought. Outside, the streets glimmered with lights and movement, a world moving forward as if nothing had changed. Inside, the Millers carried the invisible ledger of survival: every sacrifice, every choice, every ounce of endurance, all counted silently in the hearts and minds of those who bore them. The year ended as it had progressed, survival intact, but heavy, complicated, and far from easy. No one celebrated, yet no one surrendered. In the quiet spaces between exhaustion and persistence, the Millers understood a truth generations had passed along: endurance could sustain life, but it demanded everything. And for 2025, that was enough. The final months of 2025 brought a quiet tension that settled over the Millers like a slow fog. The city hummed with activity, but for them, every step felt weighed down by choices that could not be deferred. Survival had become a constant negotiation, a balancing act that left no room for mistakes, no margin for relief. Anna continued to carry the heaviest load. Her shifts at the hospital had become longer, the floors crowded, the patients exhausted from lingering illnesses and complications. Protective gear remained limited, supplies tight. Each decision, a medication administered, a patient moved, a life stabilized, carried a subtle but persistent pressure. Back at home, her body ached from the physical demands, her mind from the emotional weight. She often sat in silence, staring at the dim light in the kitchen, a cup of lukewarm tea in hand, wondering how much longer she could sustain this pace. Emily, in her small apartment, worked late into the night. Spreadsheets of budgets and bills sprawled across her desk, a chaotic map of numbers she could not escape. Inflation gnawed at her income, rent consumed half her paycheck, and every dollar spent seemed to subtract from her future. She had learned to ration, to plan, to anticipate, yet the stress seeped into her bones. On some nights, she pressed her head against the cool tabletop and whispered to herself, "Is this what surviving forever feels like?" The question had no answer, only persistence. Jacob's teaching days had grown longer, heavier. Students returned after months of disruptions, some carrying scars unseen, some eager but fragile, some lost entirely in the quiet collapse of stability. He worked tirelessly, tutoring after class, checking on students who didn't show up, advocating for support where none existed. At home, he collapsed into the chair, tired in ways sleep could not fix. Every evening, he reflected on the cycle his family had endured: decades of quiet struggle, incremental survival, sacrifice layered upon sacrifice. And he realized that endurance could save life, but it could not shield the spirit entirely. Michael, slower now, still moved among the families he supported at the community center. The demand was unceasing: food assistance, emergency shelter, emotional guidance. Volunteers worked tirelessly, but the energy of youth was finite, the resources nearly exhausted. Michael noticed the subtle despair creeping into the eyes of families he had known for years, eyes that once held hope now dull with worry. He tried to shield them, tried to distribute the little he had effectively, but the limits of the system were always apparent. Even his own endurance was tested in ways it hadn't been before, every decision measured against the backdrop of scarcity. David, quietly observing, continued his routines with careful precision. The stock market's fluctuations kept him alert, inflation reminded him of fragility, and bills remained a relentless tide. He walked the city streets with a sense of both detachment and attentiveness, noticing the contrast between the glittering wealth displayed in store windows and the worn faces of workers lining buses and subways. The disparities were stark, relentless, and unyielding. Survival was never equal, he realized, and even endurance came at a cost. The miller's home, though modest, had become a hub of careful planning and measured routines. Dinners were simple, conversations often veering toward logistics and decisions, rarely drifting into leisure. Emily often reminded Jacob to check the utility bills, Jacob reminded Emily about student loans, Anna reminded them both to rest, but rest was rare, and energy even rarer. Each member carried invisible loads, silently tallying each day's sacrifices. Even small joys were tempered by awareness. Emily's laughter at a niece's joke was brief, Jacob's pride at a student's progress fleeting, Anna's quiet smile after a long shift ephemeral. Every moment was framed by the knowledge that tomorrow would demand the same endurance, that no victory could erase the persistent pressures of 2025. Inflation had altered the texture of daily life. Grocery shopping required strategy, buy bulk and risk spoilage or smaller quantities and stretch the money. Utility bills demanded rationing of warmth and light. Even minor emergencies, a cracked faucet, a failing heater, became sources of anxiety rather than inconvenience. Money was never enough, yet work and endurance demanded it constantly. Emily and Jacob felt subtle fractures forming. The weight of survival had begun to press not only externally, but inward. Minor disagreements flared into tension, fatigue tinted conversations with impatience. They recognized the pattern, a mirror of what their mother and grandmother had experienced, but understanding did not soften the strain. Endurance had always been expected of them, and failure was not a permitted option. Anna, ever observant, noticed these strains in her children. She saw their exhaustion, their quiet frustration, and the shadow of despair that lingered at the edges of laughter. She knew the cost of survival intimately, knew how silently it could erode relationships and spirit. She tried to guide them gently, reminding them to pause, to breathe, to value one another in moments that were otherwise consumed by external pressures. Michael, seeing the young families he supported, recognized the same quiet erosion in them. Children going hungry, parents overworked, older siblings sacrificing for younger, the invisible toll of endurance pressing across generations. He noted the similarities with his own family history, the miller's lineage of resilience and struggle, and understood that endurance was both a strength and a burden. David, reflecting quietly in the evenings, realized that survival in 2025 had become a silent, internalized battle. It was not the drama of a crash or the chaos of a headline, it was the daily arithmetic of bills, the negotiation of resources, the quiet erosion of energy. It was unremarkable, invisible to the outside, yet consuming from within. One night, the Millers gathered for a rare shared meal. Emily had cooked simply, vegetables, rice, bread. The room smelled faintly of warmth, of effort, of home. Conversation was sparse at first, but slowly, they began to share pieces of their day. Emily spoke of her spreadsheet battles, Jacob of a student's small triumph, Anna of a patient's quiet recovery, Michael of a family that had remained housed against odds, David of the calm he found walking city streets. Each story was small, but collectively, they reminded the family that endurance had meaning beyond numbers. Yet the weight of 2025 remained. Inflation, exhaustion, relentless responsibilities, all loomed over them. Each day required calculation, each night demanded reflection. Survival had been earned repeatedly, across decades, yet its cost was unmistakable. The Millers were alive, intact, and yet not untouched. Their resilience was both a shield and a burden, each member carrying it silently, shaping choices, shaping moods, shaping futures. In the quiet hours before dawn, Anna sat in the kitchen, the hum of the city faint beyond the walls. She thought of her parents, of Ruth, of Samuel, of the generations who had endured before. She touched her hands to her face, feeling fatigue in her bones, and whispered softly, "We endure, we endure." The words were both affirmation and recognition. Survival came at a price, and that price was carried quietly, daily, without pause. Emily, in her bedroom, reviewed her budget one last time before sleep. Numbers stared back, precise and unyielding. She counted pennies, planned meals, mapped expenses. It was exhausting, yet it was necessary. She realized that survival in 2025 was not a single dramatic act, but a continuous, measured endurance. Every choice mattered, every sacrifice accumulated, every moment required awareness. Jacob, lying beside her later, reflected on the students he taught, the bills he paid, the meals he rationed. He understood that endurance was neither heroic nor public, it was intimate, invisible, relentless. And he understood, too, that it shaped who they were, who they would become, and what the Millers' legacy of survival truly meant. By the final days of 2025, the Millers faced no dramatic resolution. The year ended as it had progressed, alive, persevering, quietly weighed by responsibility. No fireworks, no sudden triumphs, only the persistent, measured cadence of survival. They remained together, each member bearing their invisible burdens, each step forward deliberate, each breath a small victory. And as the city settled into the deep quiet of a winter night, the Millers, though exhausted, endured. The cost of survival was still being counted, silently, internally, invisibly. And in that endurance lay both the strength and the fragile truth of 2025, to survive was to carry, every day, the full weight of life itself. The final weeks of 2025 were quiet, almost deceptively calm. Outside, the city pulsed with lights and movement, people chasing commerce, errands, fleeting celebrations. Inside the Miller household, life moved with slower rhythms, deliberate and careful, each breath measured against responsibilities and exhaustion. Anna, returning from another grueling shift at the hospital, entered her apartment with a soft sigh. The walls seemed to embrace her briefly, the silence wrapping around her like a fragile comfort. She placed her bag down, peeled off her scrubs, and rested briefly in the dim light of the kitchen. Her hands, worn from years of patient care, trembled slightly as she touched a worn photograph of Ruth smiling at a long-ago birthday. Memories whispered through her mind, decades of endurance, sacrifice, choices made for survival, long nights without sleep, small victories that had kept them going. Emily, in her bedroom, hunched over her laptop, reviewed the family budget once more. Each number felt heavier tonight, as if the weight of inflation, bills, and obligations had condensed into ink and columns. She paused, closing her eyes, and allowed herself a small, quiet exhale. Even amidst the exhaustion, she found solace in calculation. It gave her a sense of control, however temporary, over a world that often felt uncontrollable. Jacob, sitting beside her for a brief respite from grading papers, rubbed his eyes. He had spent the day navigating classrooms, tutoring students behind screens, answering urgent calls from parents, and negotiating the impossible. The quiet of the evening, a rare interlude, allowed him to reflect on the resilience required not just of himself, but of those around him. He understood deeply that survival was cumulative, not sudden, a product of countless small choices, sacrifices, and endurance layered over decades. Michael, from across the city, observed families at the community center, the quiet hum of winter carrying through the halls. He noted faces familiar and new, eyes reflecting exhaustion, worry, and faint hope. Volunteers moved carefully, navigating both their own fatigue and the needs of those they served. Michael's own body reminded him of age, his energy finite, yet he persisted. He knew the fragility of survival, but also its necessity. Each meal delivered, each word of comfort offered, was a small act against the tide of scarcity pressing down upon them. David, quietly seated in his apartment, watched the city's glow from his window. Inflation continued its subtle, invisible pressure, markets fluctuated, and the ordinary costs of life pressed relentlessly. Yet in the quiet, he reflected on the endurance of his family, their unspoken resilience, and the intricate calculations, both financial and emotional, that had allowed them to navigate 2025 with their lives intact. Survival was a ledger written not just in money, but in patience, persistence, and human connection. The Millers gathered one evening for a simple meal. Emily had prepared soup and bread, Anna had added a small salad she had managed to assemble from what remained in the pantry. Jacob carved the bread, and each family member took a portion. Conversation flowed in fragments, updates on work, brief mentions of the day's small victories, reflections on minor disappointments. Laughter was rare, but when it surfaced, it was genuine, fleeting, a fragile thread tying them together in the midst of their ongoing struggle. Even in these quiet moments, the weight of survival remained palpable. Inflation, scarcity, fatigue, and uncertainty hovered in the background like a persistent shadow. Each member carried burdens in their own way, Anna through physical and emotional exhaustion, Emily through calculations and planning, Jacob through emotional labor and quiet worry, Michael through responsibility for others, David through observation and caution. Every choice, every expenditure, every action was measured against both necessity and consequence. The conversations that night shifted to reflections, not dramatic or sweeping, but intimate and real. Anna spoke softly about the toll of her work, the fatigue that never seemed to fully lift. Emily shared her worry about long-term stability, the constant calculation of how to stretch resources. Jacob reflected on the students who struggled, the families facing hardship, the quiet weight of responsibility pressing on him daily. Michael reminded them of the small victories, the family that remained housed, the meals that reached those in need, the moments of human connection preserved against adversity. David listened, offering quiet acknowledgement, a reminder that endurance was shared, that survival was collective, and that each contribution mattered. The air was heavy with acknowledgement, survival demanded everything, yet gave little in return. The Millers had persisted through decades of economic pressure, societal change, and personal sacrifice. 2025 had tested them as none of them expected. Inflation, exhaustion, uncertainty, all had become familiar companions. Yet through it, they remained intact, bound together by shared struggle, love, and persistence. Emily, glancing around the table, realized that the family's endurance was a quiet story. There were no grand headlines, no sudden fortunes, no dramatic reversals. Their survival was a product of choices made day after day, of small acts of perseverance, of silent calculations and private sacrifices. She understood, in a deep, almost painful way, that survival had always demanded more than the world acknowledged, and that it would continue to demand more than she sometimes felt capable of giving. Jacob reached out and took her hand. It was not a gesture of reassurance alone, it was acknowledgement of shared struggle. They had endured together, carried burdens together, and in that endurance, they found both a fragile comfort and a profound truth. Survival was neither heroic nor glamorous, it was quiet, relentless, and demanding, and it required connection, effort, and unwavering commitment. Anna, watching them, felt a rare relief. The Millers' history was not a series of dramatic crises, but a continuous thread of perseverance. She saw in her children a reflection of that endurance, aware of its cost, aware of its necessity. She understood that life would continue to test them, but she also saw that the family's resilience remained intact, unbroken even under relentless pressure. Michael and David, though physically apart from this meal, carried similar reflections in their minds. They recognized that survival in 2025 was not about momentary triumphs, it was about the ongoing commitment to endure, to support, and to persist despite exhaustion and scarcity. Each day's quiet choices, the meals prepared, the hours worked, the care given, were victories in their own right. The night deepened, and the Millers slowly dispersed to their rooms, each carrying the weight of the day and the reflections of the year. They knew that survival was far from complete, that the pressures of life would continue into the coming months. Yet in this quiet moment, they also recognized that endurance, however heavy, had brought them here, intact and connected. 2025 closed not with fanfare, but with quiet recognition. The Millers had survived, yes, but they had done so through persistence, calculation, sacrifice, and love. The cost of survival had been immense, but it had been met with courage, attention, and unspoken commitment. They understood that the journey would continue, that challenges lay ahead, but for now, they could acknowledge the endurance that had carried them through a year that demanded more than any single person could bear alone. And in that acknowledgement, there was a fragile kind of peace. Survival was not complete, but it was present. It was a ledger written in human effort, resilience, and care, a testament to the quiet, relentless courage of a family bound together through decades of struggle. The Millers, in their modest apartment, in the dim city lights, in the silent hum of winter nights, carried the truth of 2025. Survival required everything, yet it also revealed what mattered most: connection, perseverance, and the small, enduring acts that kept a family alive and intact, even when the price felt unbearably high. The Millers' story does not end with resolution, because life rarely offers neat conclusions. Their journey through 2025, through exhaustion, scarcity, and unrelenting responsibility, leaves them alive, connected, but quietly transformed. Each member carries the invisible ledger of survival: choices made, sacrifices endured, resilience measured in small, daily acts that go unnoticed by the world. In the dim light of their apartment, in the hum of the city outside, the weight they bear is palpable. Inflation, bills, fatigue, uncertainty, they are constants, unyielding companions that shape not just their days, but their relationships, their dreams, their very sense of self. Yet within that weight lies a quiet testament: endurance, persistence, and the unspoken strength of connection. Survival may demand everything, but it also reveals what is most essential: love, attention, and the threads of humanity that bind them across generations. The story of the Millers is the story of countless families across America, navigating hidden pressures, making daily calculations, and persevering when the cost feels unbearable. It is a reminder that survival is neither heroic nor glamorous, yet it is profound, shaping lives in ways both visible and invisible. And as the city breathes through the night, as the Millers rest, recover, and prepare for another day, one truth lingers: endurance is heavy, but it is also enduring. It is the quiet heartbeat of life itself, and in that heartbeat, hope persists, even when the price feels too heavy to pay.